a new species will be added to Washington's forests. You discover everything from how to identify wildlife to who owns Washington's forests and what's being done to protect them. Just call 1-800-45-WOODS today for our free guide and take a walk on the wild side.
If you're like most people here in Washington, you have some questions about what's happening in this state's forests. How many trees do we actually have? Are we over-harvesting? Where is the old growth? Why is the practice of clear-cutting used? What's being done to protect fish and wildlife? In the next half hour, we'll be talking about these questions and more. Hello, I'm Jim Harriott. Welcome to the Washington Private Forest Report. It's being brought to you by the Washington Forest Protection Association. I'll tell you more about this association in a minute. But first, let's take a look at who owns the forest land here in Washington.
Now, do you guys know what this kind of tree is right here? Hemlock. Hemlock. And what's special about a hemlock tree?
Candace Cahill is a forester, and on this day, a tour guide for a group of students. We'll join Candace and her group throughout this program as they explore a privately owned working forest.
We're standing in a private timberland, a private tree farm. Who do you think owns most of the timberland in Washington State? How would you?
The government.
The government, right. 60% of the timberland in Washington State is owned by government, either the federal government, the state government, or local government. Well, who owns the rest of the forest land?
Private.
Private, that's right. Over 30% of the timberland in Washington State is owned by private landowners, companies and private individuals. And what do you think goes on in the lands that are owned by private people and private companies?
They buy them for hunting or making houses.
Build houses, right. Timberland is important because we cut down trees and we manufacture products to build houses with them, right?
Who owns this place?
This place here is a private tree farm, and it's owned by a private timber company here in Washington State.
This program is being brought to you by an organization of these private forest owners. The organization is called the Washington Forest Protection Association. It was founded in 1908, and its original purpose was to help fight forest fires. Today, the association represents the interests of many private forest owners throughout the state. When you talk about millions of acres of forest land, it sounds as if you have a lot of trees in this state. But what are the realities? Are we cutting too many trees? Are we losing our forests? A state study on long-range timber supply addressed those very questions. Helping with that study was Bruce Lipke from the University of Washington School of Forestry.
The whole principle of the timber supply study is to determine whether we're going to run out of trees. And the clear answer from the timber supply study is we've got plenty of trees to sustain the harvest level forever. Whatever we do on the preservation account, those trees are set aside. We can still manage the rest of the acres, keep them on a rotation, and sustain the harvest levels for a long period of time. The issue at the moment is we have two different kinds of approaches to trying to manage the forest. One is to set large parts of the forest aside into preservation. The other approach is to proactively manage the lands, and in the process of doing that, create both high-quality timber at the same time you've increased habitat. Now, in reality, we want to do a little bit of all those. It gets down to a question of mix. And how much do we set aside, and how much do we manage progressively?
What is a managed forest? And what does Professor Lipke mean when he talks about managing progressively? Don't trees just grow naturally? Well, here are some people who can help answer those questions.
We're trying to manage our forest lands on an intensive cycle. We've got some of the most fertile soils in the world and some of the most productive and high-quality trees. And Douglas fir is the predominant tree species that we find in our western forest. We do concentrate on planting Douglas fir, but the forest is a mosaic. You'll see the variety of trees. And if we don't plant them, Mother Nature replaces them. The hemlock, the fir, the cedar, the hardwoods. The reason, I guess, that companies hire foresters is not to work against Mother Nature, but to work with Mother Nature. We plant trees that are 1 to 3 years old. We enhance and protect those stands throughout its cycle. We'll fertilize it, we'll remove unwanted vegetation to give it more room and space to grow, and as the trees crowd one another, we'll come in and take out either a commercial or a non-commercial thinning.
We are generally, and I say generally, there are always a few mavericks out there, but generally we are good land managers. We are looking to the future. We cannot afford to own land that we do not take care of.
If you're concerned about clear cuts, we'll talk about them shortly. But first, let's talk about reforestation. According to a recent state study, 99% of private forest land is successfully reforested within 3 years of being harvested. But that wasn't always the case.
You know, this area's been planted, but we didn't always plant trees in the past. When the forests were first harvested in the 1940s and 1920s, and sometimes even earlier, the areas were left to reseed naturally. Later, in the 1940s, then people started experimenting with planting some trees here and there and being more organized about the way we forested. Then in the 60s and 70s, replanting became very popular.
Why wouldn't the people who own timber and log the area and left it to naturally grow back, why wouldn't they plant it in the first place? Because if they own land, and they'd want more trees on there.
Well, this is true, and that's something that they found out. I think that people didn't really understand that process early on when they first did the first harvesting in the first part of the century.
Today, seedlings are raised in nurseries for up to 3 years, and then they're returned to the same geographic area the seeds originally came from. Now, here's Bill Jacobs, Executive Director of the Washington Forest Protection Association.
Our owners plant 200,000 trees a day from January until June. 200,000 a day. Those trees will grow over time, but it will be 50 or 60 years before that tree planted today will go on the market.
Craig Beals is a professional forester. He was responsible for replanting the trees in this part of the forest.
The area I'm standing in was clear-cut about 12 years ago, and it was replanted immediately after harvest, as are most all of our forests. This tree next to me is very typical of a 12-year-old tree.
35 million trees are planted in private forests every year. The trees are all planted by hand, and at least 85% make it through the most difficult first 7 years of life. Craig Beals joins us now to talk more about it. Mr. Beals, how much old growth is there in Washington's private forests?
Very few acres of private forest land is actually in old-growth timber. Almost all of it is in second-growth timber, timber that was cut during the turn of the century. So just about everything that we're harvesting today is young second-growth timber.
So the trees we see behind you are all second or even third growth?
Yeah, everything that you can see here is an area that's actually been harvested twice.
What are the laws about reforestation?
There's a law in the state of Washington that requires us to adequately reforest the area after harvesting within 3 years.
And what's typical?
Typical's generally about 18 months.
In western Washington, is every acre replanted?
Every acre is replanted. It's in private forest land owners' best interest to replant everything they harvest.
Are we ever going to run out of trees?
No way. Not in my lifetime, not in my kids' lifetime, not in anybody's lifetime.
Thank you, Mr. Beals.
Thank you.
So far, we've talked primarily about forest practices on the west side of the Cascades. But there are millions of trees on the east side of the state, too. East of the mountains, the climate is comparatively dry, and tree-growing conditions are much harsher.
The management style here on the east side of the mountains is considerably different from the west side. Predominantly, it is partial cut harvesting or selective harvesting.
Well, our climate is drier, and the trees need a little more shade to regenerate. And so we tend to leave more trees, mature trees, on the site after harvest.
There's a lot of folks that would probably ask the question, why can't they partial cut on the west side as we are in the east side? And my answer to that is that we are dealing totally with two different ecosystems.
If you talk to people about Washington's forests, there's one subject that's bound to come up. It's the harvesting method called clear cutting. Here with me now are two members of the Washington Forest Practices Board, Jim Stevenson and Jack Ward. each has a distinctly different view about the value and necessity of clear cuts. Okay, Mr. Ward, there's no question that clear cutting is ugly. So why do timber companies continue to do it?
Well, Jim, there's several reasons. The first reason is clear cutting is more efficient. Therefore, it holds the cost down, holds the value, the cost of the end product down. Secondly, it allows sunlight to come into the area after it's been harvested to allow our Douglas fir seedlings to grow, and that seedling requires sunlight.
They even refer to the term shade intolerant for Douglas fir.
That's correct. There are other species of trees that are more shade tolerant that can handle and grow underneath of other trees, but Douglas fir requires direct and open sunlight.
Okay, Mr. Stevenson, your main concerns about the clear cutting method?
I think the primary thing is the clear cutting in wide areas. In other words, a single clear cut in itself would not be so objectionable, but when you add one against another until they go from ridge to ridge, particularly along some of the more scenic highways that we have in this state, it's come to the attention of the public, and they look at it and they think something must be wrong.
There are new regulations regarding clear cutting, Jim Stevenson. Are you satisfied they'll do the job?
Well, I think they're a good start. The 240-acre limitation is a good start. It's no longer possible for the widespread clear cutting that would go from ridge to ridge. It'll remain to be seen what that looks like on the landscape.
Now, one of the regulations is 120 acres, and then you have to have a special hearing to go beyond that. Isn't that true?
What happens is once you exceed 120 acres, the Department of Natural Resources, which is the regulatory agency over harvesting, has the right, if they feel it's necessary, to call what's called an interdisciplinary team of experts to come out and review the clear cut to see if there's any special concerns. I'd also like to say that industry in general has had a major shift in its outlook on the size of clear cuts. And most of the major landowners now are trying to separate their clear cuts and keep them to sizes under 120 acres.
I would assume that you're happy with that movement.
Well, we think it's a start. I feel that there's more things that should be done, and I believe the timber industry agrees with that, and I'm very pleased that they have recognized the problems and we've worked together. I hope we can continue to do that.
You're talking to each other, not past each other.
That's exactly right. That's the way I like it.
Hear, hear. Thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
We've heard a lot about the rules changes for clear cutting. Let's see what effect that's been having in our forests.
One of the main things we do is provide leave areas to give for wildlife cover.
Have you guys ever been in an old growth forest? An old growth before? Well, this is kind of our attempt to try to mimic or try to look like an old growth forest.
Many private foresters throughout the state are experimenting with new techniques to protect and enhance fish and wildlife resources. But all foresters follow new harvesting rules enacted by the state. Brian Gilbert is a wildlife biologist.
The new regulations call for us to leave trees in harvest units. They increase the protection of streams and water areas like wetlands. So all those things together are trying to focus at providing forested type habitat on a managed landscape.
You said that you leave a few trees after you clear cut. Is there any particular trees or kind of trees that you leave?
Yeah. I work with we have foresters who are responsible for setting up the timber sales. And I go out with those foresters and we talk about the best place to leave the leaf trees. Maybe there's some older trees that have some really good big branches on them and they're near a wet area or something like that. So we try to leave the trees in the best place we can. So what we try to do is find ways to balance our harvesting, our cutting of trees with providing habitats. This is what we call radio telemetry gear, and wildlife biologists use telemetry gear to find out the locations of animals. You all know what elk are?
Yeah.
We have some elk with radio collars on, and we're going out to find where these elk cows or female elk have their calves, their young babies. And then once we find out where those areas are, we can better protect those areas and keep people out of them during the calving season.
What are some of the ways that you use to protect the animals?
We do a lot of things to protect the wildlife or the areas where the wildlife are using by putting gates in which stop the people from driving into those areas, which may harass or bother the animals. We can also manage our harvesting where we cut our trees. We can do different things in different areas depending on what kind of wildlife habitat those animals need. Some species like the open space like deer and elk, some species like the mature timber. And by managing your land for those different habitats, you can provide habitat for a diversity of species, more than just several or a few species. You can get the whole range of species.
Another issue concerns the rivers and streams of Washington. Are salmon runs being ruined? And if so, who's at fault?
Okay, we've got a guest, a visitor with us today, who comes from Oregon to talk to us about streams. It's Dr. John Palmisano. And Dr. Palmisano, I understand you did an analysis of a project where you looked at the impacts of harvesting on streams and fish habitat. Could you tell us a little bit about the results of that?
Yes, we conducted a study about 1.5 years ago where we looked at the impacts of logging. And the biggest factor you're concerned about in logging are increased sediment loads to the stream. Sediments can smother salmon eggs, and they could retard the growth and development of juvenile salmon. And this was one of the factors that we looked at in our study.
If you clear cut at the top of the stream, does it affect going down further?
It depends upon the lay of the land. If the land is very steep and there's nothing to stop the sediments, then it could impact the stream. If there are buffer zones, areas of vegetation that are left alongside the stream, then there may be no impact at all from clear cutting upstream.
Are there other uses along a stream that might impact it as much as logging, or maybe even more than logging?
Okay, the relative impacts of logging, as we said, it increases sediment load, which could be detrimental. If shade is reduced, then it raises water temperature, and that could have a detrimental effect on salmon. But relative to what happens downstream, that may not be very important. The most important criteria is we need to keep water in the streams. We have to keep minimum stream flows to keep our salmon population thriving.
Buffer strips of trees around every fish-bearing river, stream, and lake are now required by law. Other changes include road building techniques.
Our roads have traditionally been our biggest problem especially from the periods of the 1960s to the 1980s in terms of being sediment producers. And we feel that our new and modern techniques in building roads has done a great deal to eliminate that as a problem.
What we're doing now is we're trying to move roads away and close roads and reduce the road density so that we're reducing those problems. And at the same time, we're redesigning roads and providing drainage so that the water that collects along roads is sent back into the forest floor rather than into streams.
There's been a number of changes in the forest practice regulations in the last 5 years, largely an immediate response to the research that's been done. And so we leave areas around the stream anywhere from 25 to 100 feet, and voluntarily larger sizes up to 300 feet along all fish-bearing streams.
That all sounds good, but some people would say the current regulations are not enough, that we need to look at the big picture.
Things are not as rosy around here as you think they are, but we ain't going to turn away and walk away from these problems. We're going to meet them head on and try to keep people together to do some things and get the miles for our money, whatever we have to do to restore these watersheds.
Currently in the state of Washington, there's a variety of agencies, tribes, environmental groups, and industry have been developing a way of doing watershed planning.
We're involved with the Yakima Resource Management Cooperative. We work cooperatively with environmental groups and state environmental agencies in the Yakima Indian Nation to take care of the resources such as water quality and anadromous fish habitat. We plan timber harvests and timber management activities, and if there's concern about the impact of those activities on the other resources, we get together and work out mitigation plans.
Today we're at a place where we've learned quite a bit more about how streams and fish work and how wildlife works. We tend to treat them separately.
The future will hold a style where we will read landscapes for both their fisheries, their streamside effects, and for wildlife values, and make very localized decisions, but tailored and designed to the landscape itself.
We have to make a decision in this state that we're going to have timber here. We have to make a decision that we're going to have people working in the timber business. We're going to have make a decision that we're going to have salmon in these rivers and in these watersheds, that we're going to move on and not make them mistakes anymore.
Let's turn now to some of the social and economic issues concerning forests. Washington is, of course, one of the largest producers of forest products in the world, but only a quarter of the trees from this state are harvested from federal and state land. Nearly three-quarters come from privately owned forests.
There are a lot of measurements a person can apply if they want to the importance of private forest landowners. We provide jobs, 50,000 direct jobs, about 200,000 indirect. It's a lot of jobs, a lot of taxes are paid on those salaries. Another is the diversified wildlife habitat that it provides. More than 10% of private lands are voluntarily set aside for all of these other uses other than production of wood. I've often thought that if you didn't have an industry like this that provides beautiful wood products to people, ranging from houses to furniture to artwork, somebody'd try to invent it. It's renewable, it provides jobs, it provides a tax base, it provides beauty, and so we have to have some confidence in the future. We have to know we're still going to be here. We have to know that the regulations are not going to be so horrendous that it's no longer possible to stay in the business.
The business wants stability. The tribes want stability. The state wants stability. And stability takes us into the future.
The problem that we are having nowadays is that the trees may be there, but there may be a number of conflicting regulations or things that are happening that prevent them from harvesting their trees, in which case they may have no option but to sell the land. It's very hard to sell the land. I would take almost any alternative first.
With me now are Dr. Bob Lee, who's Professor of Sociology of Natural Resources at the University of Washington. Kay Gabriel is Director of the Forest Products Division of the State Department of Trade and Economic Development. And Dick Larson is former Associate Editor of the Seattle Times. Welcome. Kay Gabriel, let's begin with you. Just how valuable is the forest products industry?
Well, the industry has been a foundation of the state's economy for more than 100 years, and today it is the second largest manufacturing sector, employing more than 50,000 people. And I think we have to realize that those 50,000 people are family wage jobs, jobs that are solid, good-paying jobs that enable a family to survive.
Bob, your perspective on that?
If we look at the rural sector, where most of the logging and manufacturing takes place, we've got a vital human resource there. The people who have the knowledge and the skill to produce the commodities that those of us in the cities consume.
Dick Larson, you're a long-time writer and observer of the private forest industry. What role do you think it plays?
I go almost to the romantic level of it because, as an old Washingtonian as well, you have the state that has its waterways and its fishing industry and the traditions of that. We have Eastern Washington with its traditional dryland farming. And the forest products industry is part of that, too. It's almost part of the character of our state.
Kay, we think of the timber industry as being big business, but we're talking about relatively small family businesses as well, and there's a danger of losing some of our rural communities in the state, is there not?
That's correct. That indeed we do mostly think of the large landowning companies when we think of the industry, but indeed most of the employment comes from small to medium-sized manufacturers. These smaller businesses are the backbone of our state's economy, and they're the backbone of these rural communities. They hold the values that we all think so highly of, and indeed there is a danger that we will lose not only these businesses but the values that go with them.
And what we need is some kind of a renewed sense of social agreement or contract between the producer communities and the consumer communities, so it's understood that we can have these economic functions served and at the same time have a quality environment over the long run.
And surely we have the capability, I think, of being able to do both, to grow, to enjoy the environment at the same time, produce a product that's desperately needed and will always be needed and long-term needed over the worldwide.
Thank you. That's all the time we have. I'm Jim Harriott. I hope you've learned some things about this state's forests. I know I have. This has been the Washington Private Forest Report. We thank you for joining us. Thanks to our panelists as well. We'll close now with a few last thoughts. Good to see you.
This is a unique business. You're managing what is regarded by the public as a public resource. They care about what goes on, even though it may be private lands.
We're hoping over time that we can show that we can manage timber so that we'll not only be able to harvest timber and manage our land, but also be able to protect the endangered species.
What we're trying to do is we're trying to find a balance between providing for other resources like wildlife and for streams and things like that, as well as providing an economic incentive for the industry to stay in business.
I work in the forest on a day-to-day basis with foresters, with people that are committed.
I want to see the timber industry and the tribes and the state of Washington taking a proactive look into the future and get creative at putting a comprehensive plan together, whether it's talking about salmon, whether it's talking about the spotted owl, whether it's talking about the old growth timber. This is us. It isn't anybody else. Who the hell else is out here? Nobody. And if we can't put it together, nobody can.